Katherine picked up her purse from beside the chair, a simple leather bag that she slung over her shoulder with a finality that made it clear she was done with this conversation. Jenna wiped at her eyes, smudging her carefully applied makeup, and made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of this interview. She said that if Katherine left like this, it would become the story that the walk-off would overshadow everything else, including the film Katherine wanted to promote. Katherine paused, turning back to face the hosts one more time. She said that maybe that was exactly what needed to happen, that maybe people needed to see this, needed to witness what happened when someone finally said, enough. She said her film would find its audience with or without this interview, but this moment, this conversation, might actually matter more in the long run. She said if her walking off made people think about how women were treated in these settings, about the double standards and the casual disrespect disguised as entertainment, then maybe it was worth more than any promotional soundbite she could have given. One of the co-hosts, the one who had shown some understanding earlier, asked Katherine to please reconsider, saying they could learn from this, that they could do better. Katherine looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition of sincerity perhaps. But then Katherine shook her head slowly. She said that doing better required more than just good intentions in the moment. It required systemic change in how these shows were produced, how questions were developed, how guests were treated. She said one conversation wasn't going to fix that. Jenna, her voice thick with emotion, said they could start, though, that this could be the beginning of that change. She asked what it would take for Katherine to stay, to finish the interview in a way that felt right. Katherine was quiet for a long moment, and you could see her weighing the question, considering whether there was any path forward. Finally, she said that staying would require them to acknowledge, on camera, what had happened here. It would require an honest conversation about the questions they had asked and why those questions were problematic. She said it would require them to admit that they had prioritized creating drama over respecting their guest, that they had fallen into the same tired patterns that plague celebrity journalism. She said if they were willing to have that conversation, genuinely and without defensiveness, then maybe there was something worth salvaging. The hosts looked at each other, uncertainty written across their faces. This wasn't the kind of television they were used to making. Morning shows thrived on positivity and lightness, on making audiences feel good while they drank their coffee. The producer stepped forward again, his expression troubled. He said he didn't think they could air something like that it would be too controversial, too messy. Katherine turned to him with a look of profound weariness. She said that was exactly the problem, that missinses and honesty were considered too risky. So instead, everyone maintained pleasant facades while perpetuating harmful dynamics underneath. She said she would rather have an honest, uncomfortable conversation that challenged people than a sanitized, friendly one that changed nothing. Jenna looked at the producer, then back at Katherine. You could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, torn between her role as a host who needed to maintain the show's brand and her own recognition that Katherine had a point. She said she wanted to have that conversation, that she thought it was important, but the producer was shaking his head, saying they needed to think about the network, about sponsors, about all the stakeholders who had expectations about what this show was supposed to be. Katherine let out a breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder. She said that was the answer then, that the system was more important than the truth, that protecting the brand mattered more than treating people with dignity. She said she had her answer about whether anything could really change here. Jenna protested, saying that wasn't fair, that there were real constraints they had to work within. Katherine asked, when those constraints became more important than doing what was right. The question hung heavy in the air. Jenna didn't have an answer, or if she did, she couldn't articulate it through her tears. One of the other co-hosts, her voice small, said that maybe Katherine was right, that maybe they had made mistakes in how they approached this. She said she was sorry for her part in it, that she could see now how the questions had been hurtful. Katherine acknowledged the apology with a small nod, but she didn't soften. She said apologies only meant something if they led to different behavior. And she had been in this industry long enough to know that individual apologies rarely translated to systemic change. She told them that this wasn't personal, at least not entirely. She said Jenna and her co-hosts were operating within a broken system, one that rewarded controversy and punished substance, one that treated celebrities as content rather than as people. She said they were all victims of that system in different ways. But that didn't absolve them of responsibility for perpetuating it. She said change required people to make difficult choices, to risk the comfort and safety of the status quo for something better. Jenna asked what Katherine wanted them to do, her voice breaking. Katherine said she wanted them to think hard about the kind of television they were making, about whether it aligned with their values, about whether they could look at themselves in the mirror and feel good about how they treated people. She said she wanted them to consider whether getting good ratings was worth compromising their integrity. She said these were questions only they could answer, but they were questions that needed to be asked. The quiet co-host spoke again, asking Katherine if she thought it was possible to make good television, entertaining television, while still treating people with respect. Katherine's expression softened just slightly. She said yes, absolutely, that those things weren't mutually exclusive. She said there was so much genuinely interesting content available if people were willing to dig deeper than surface-level gossip. She said audiences were smarter than they were given credit for, that they could handle nuance and complexity and substance. She said the problem was that it was easier and cheaper to manufacture drama than to create quality content. So that's what most shows defaulted to. She said it took more skill, more preparation, more thought to conduct an interview that was both engaging and respectful. But it was possible. She said she had done plenty of interviews over the years that proved it could be done, where hosts asked challenging questions about her work, without resorting to personal attacks or dredging up old controversies for shock value. Jenna nodded slowly, seeming to genuinely absorb what Katherine was saying. She said she thought she understood, that she could see how they had taken the easy route and it had backfired. She said she wished they could do it over, approach it differently. Katherine said they couldn't do this interview over, but they could learn from it, could apply those lessons to how they treated future guests. She said that would be the real test, whether this moment led to any actual change in their approach. Another co-host asked if Katherine would ever come back, if she would give them another chance in the future. Katherine was quiet for a long moment, and you could see her considering the question seriously. She said she honestly didn't know, that it would depend on whether she saw evidence that things had actually changed, that this wasn't just empty promises made in the heat of the moment. She said she had been burned too many times by people who said all the right things but then went right back to their old patterns. She said that if she saw them interviewing future guests with genuine respect, asking substantive questions, prioritizing content over controversy, then maybe she would consider it. But she said she would be watching, and so would a lot of other people. She said this moment, this interview, would define how they were perceived going forward. She said they could either learn from it and grow, or they could dismiss it and prove that nothing ever really changes. The choice was theirs. The producer looked like he wanted to say something, but Katherine held up a hand to stop him. She said she had said everything she needed to say, that the rest was up to them. She adjusted her purse on her shoulder and took a step toward the studio exit. Jenna called out her name one more time, her voice desperate. Katherine stopped, but didn't turn around. Jenna said she hoped Katherine knew that despite everything, despite how badly this had gone, they really did respect her. They really did admire her work. Katherine turned her head slightly, not quite looking back at them. She said that, if that was true, they would prove it through their actions, not their words. She said respect wasn't something you claimed, it was something you demonstrated. And with that, she walked off the set, her heels clicking against the studio floor, each step echoing in the terrible silence she left behind. The hosts sat frozen, the cameras still rolling, nobody quite sure what to do next. The producer finally found his voice and called for a cut, but the damage was done. So, what do you think really caused this to spiral so completely out of control? Was it the specific questions they asked, or something deeper about how celebrity interviews are conducted? She didn't do it dramatically, didn't throw anything or make a scene in the way people might expect. She simply stood, smoothly and deliberately, reaching up to remove the small microphone clipped to her blazer. The movement was calm, controlled, but it sent shockwaves through the studio. Jenna's eyes went wide, her mouth opening slightly as she processed what was happening. The other hosts sat frozen, uncertain whether to try to stop this, or let it play out. Katherine carefully placed the microphone on the arm of the chair she had just vacated. Her movements were measured almost clinical, as if she were performing a task she had thought through completely. Jenna found her voice, asking Katherine to please sit back down, saying they could work this out, that they didn't have to end things this way. Katherine looked at her, and there was something in her expression that wasn't anger exactly, more like profound disappointment mixed with exhaustion. She said that this was exactly the problem, that they thought this could be worked out, smoothed over, fixed with a few apologetic words and a pivot to safer questions. She said the issue wasn't just this interview, it was what this interview represented. It was the fact that after decades in this industry, after building a career, after producing her own projects and working to create opportunities for other women, she was still being reduced to tabloid talking points and decade-old gossip. One of the co-hosts, her voice shaky now, said that Katherine was being unfair, that they were just doing their jobs, that asking about her past was part of getting the full picture of who she was. Katherine turned to her, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but cutting. She said that if they wanted the full picture, they would ask about her directing work, about the scripts she had in development, about the charitable foundation she ran. She said the full picture wasn't just the controversial parts that made for good television. It was the work, the craft, the actual substance of a career. Jenna stood up to now, perhaps thinking that meeting Katherine on the same level would help. She said she understood Katherine was upset, but walking off would only make things worse, would only feed into the exact narratives Katherine was complaining about. She said people would say Katherine couldn't handle tough questions, that she was proving the difficult reputation true. Katherine's laugh was sharp. She said that was the trap, wasn't it? Stay and endure disrespect disguised as journalism, or leave and be blamed for being difficult. She said she was tired of that trap, tired of having to choose between her dignity and her reputation. She asked Jenna if she had ever been put in that position, if she had ever sat across from interviewers who seemed more interested in taking her down than lifting her up. Jenna's face flushed deeper. She said that actually, yes, she had dealt with difficult interviews, that everyone in this business had. But Katherine cut her off, saying there was a difference between a difficult interview and a disrespectful one. She said difficult interviews challenged you on your work, pushed you to articulate your choices and defend your artistic decisions. Disrespectful interviews ignored your work entirely in favor of manufactured drama and personal attacks. Another co-host tried to intervene, saying that no one was attacking Katherine, that they were just asking questions that audiences wanted answered. Katherine wheeled on her, asking how she knew what audiences wanted. She asked if they had polled their viewers about whether they wanted to hear about Katherine's new film or about gossip from years ago. She said it was convenient to hide behind this idea of audience interest when really it was just easier and lazier to focus on controversy than to engage with actual content. The host stammered that they were trying to make the show entertaining, that they had to balance substance with engagement. Katherine asked at what point entertainment became more important than respect. She asked when it became acceptable to invite someone onto a show under the pretense of discussing their work, only to spend the entire time picking at old wounds and reinforcing negative narratives. She said she had been told this interview would be a conversation with friends, but friends didn't treat each other this way. Jenna's voice cracked slightly as she insisted. They did consider Katherine a friend, that there was no malice in any of this. Katherine looked at her steadily and said that intent didn't matter if the impact was harmful. She said Jenna might not have intended to make her feel disrespected and diminished, but that's exactly what had happened. She said the problem with morning show culture was this: insistence on maintaining a veneer of friendliness while asking questions that were anything but friendly. One of the producers stepped forward from behind the cameras, a man in his 40s with a headset and a clipboard. He asked if everyone could just take a breath, maybe take a short break, and reconvene. Katherine turned to look at him, and her expression made him take a step back. She asked if he was the one who had approved the questions, who had decided that this was how the interview should go. He said that the hosts had creative control over their content, that he just facilitated. Katherine said that was convenient, everyone passing responsibility to someone else. She asked who had actually made the decision to focus on controversy rather than her film. The producer looked at the hosts. The hosts looked at each other. No one wanted to claim ownership of the approach that had led to this disaster. Katherine nodded, as if this confirmed something she had long suspected. She said that was the problem with this kind of television. Everyone participated in creating harmful content, but no one wanted to be held accountable for it. Jenna, tears visible in her eyes now, said that Katherine was making this into something bigger than it was. that this was just one interview, one conversation that had gone wrong. Katherine said that was exactly the point, that it was never just one interview. It was interview after interview, year after year, the same patterns repeating. It was being asked about being difficult instead of about being talented. It was having your accomplishments ignored in favor of your controversies. It was being told to smile and play along while people picked you apart for entertainment. Another co-host, who had been mostly quiet throughout the escalation, spoke up. Her voice was soft, almost tentative. She said she thought she understood what Katherine was saying, that there was probably some truth to it. She asked what Katherine would have wanted them to ask instead, what would have made this interview feel respectful. For a moment, Katherine's expression softened slightly. She said she would have wanted them to ask about her character's journey in the new film, about what drew her to the role, about the themes they were exploring. She said she would have wanted them to ask about her production company and the kinds of stories they were working to tell. She said she would have wanted to talk about the experience of directing, about what she had learned moving behind the camera. She said there were so many substantive things they could have discussed. So many ways this conversation could have been interesting and meaningful without resorting to dredging up the past. The co-host nodded slowly, and you could see recognition dawning on her face, the realization of the opportunity they had wasted. But Jenna, perhaps feeling defensive, or perhaps just exhausted by the whole situation, pushed back. She said that Katherine's past was part of her story, that audiences connected to people's full journeys, including the difficult parts. She said there was nothing wrong with asking about it, that Katherine was overreacting. The word hung in the air like a grenade. Overreacting. She repeated the word back to Jenna, her tone dangerous. Overreacting, she said that was the ultimate dismissal, wasn't it? When a woman stood up for herself, defended her boundaries, refused to accept poor treatment, she was accused of overreacting. She asked Jenna if she would say the same thing to a man in this situation, if she would tell him he was being too sensitive, too emotional, too much. Jenna opened her mouth, but no words came out. Katherine continued, saying this was the exact kind of gaslighting that women faced constantly. Being told that their legitimate grievances were overreactions, that they were making mountains out of molehills. She said she wasn't overreacting. She was reacting proportionally to being disrespected on national television. She said that the fact that Jenna couldn't see the difference was part of the problem. She said women had been conditioned to accept mistreatment with grace, to laugh off insults, to minimize their own discomfort for the sake of being agreeable. She said she was done with that she had reached a point in her life and career where she wasn't going to participate in her own diminishment anymore. The studio was absolutely paralyzed. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of this unraveling. Someone should have called cut, should have stopped filming, but no one did. Maybe they were too shocked, or maybe some part of them knew this was important, that this needed to be documented. Jenna was openly crying now, saying she never meant to hurt Katherine, that she was sorry if that's how it came across. Katherine's expression remained hard. She said sorry wasn't enough when the same patterns kept repeating, when the apology didn't come with any real change or understanding. What happens when a casual morning interview turns into one of the most uncomfortable moments in daytime television history? You're about to witness a conversation that spiraled so far out of control, the guest walked off set in the middle of filming. If you want to see how things can go from friendly to hostile in seconds, you need to subscribe right now and drop a comment below telling me what you think really caused this blow-up. Now, let's get into what actually went down. The studio lights were bright that morning, the kind of brightness that makes everything feel exposed, raw, unfiltered. Katherine Heigl walked onto the set of Today with Jenna and Friends with a smile that seemed just a little too practiced, a little too tight at the edges. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a black top, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. Jenna Bush Hager sat across from her, flanked by her co-hosts, all of them holding their coffee mugs with that rehearsed morning show enthusiasm. Jenna started with the usual pleasantries, the kind of softball questions that are supposed to warm everyone up. How was Katherine doing? What had she been up to lately? The typical setup before getting into the real interview. Katherine answered with the polish of someone who had done 1,000 of these, her responses flowing easily, her laugh timed perfectly. But there was something underneath it, something in the way her eyes didn't quite match her smile. Attention that the cameras were picking up, even if the hosts hadn't noticed it yet. Then Jenna shifted gears. She leaned forward slightly, that move hosts do when they think they're about to ask something clever, something that will get a great sense. She brought up Katherine's past, specifically some comments Katherine had made years ago about her experience on a popular medical drama. Comments that had caused quite a stir at the time. Jenna framed it as a question about growth, about how Katherine looked back on that period of her career now. Katherine's smile faltered. Just for a second, but it was there, a crack in the facade. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice had changed. It wasn't hostile yet, but it wasn't friendly anymore either. She said she thought it was interesting that they were bringing up something from so long ago that she had moved on and grown. And she wondered why the focus was always on past controversies rather than current work. Jenna laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind that betrayed she knew she had hit a nerve. She tried to pivot, saying that it was just about the journey, about how we all evolve. But one of the other hosts, trying to be helpful, jumped in and made it worse. She said something about how Katherine had developed a reputation for being difficult to work with, and wasn't it brave of her to own that and change? The temperature in the room dropped. You could see it in Katherine's posture, the way she straightened up, the way her hands gripped the armrests of her chair just a little tighter. She asked, very calmly, very deliberately, what exactly they meant by difficult. Her voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. A warning that anyone with sense would have heeded. The hosts looked at each other. That quick glance that people share when they realize they might be in trouble but aren't sure how to get out of it. Jenna tried to smooth it over, saying they weren't calling her difficult. They were just referencing what had been reported in the media over the years. Katherine cut her off, asking if they had actually read those reports or if they were just repeating gossip they had heard. She wanted to know if they had any specific examples, or if they were just comfortable making vague accusations on national television. The studio got very quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear the cameras humming, where every small movement sounds amplified. Jenna tried to laugh it off again, saying they were all friends here, that this was just a conversation. But Katherine wasn't laughing. She said that if they were friends, maybe they would ask her about the project she came here to promote instead of dredging up tabloid narratives from a decade ago. One of the other hosts, perhaps sensing that Jenna was floundering, attempted to redirect the conversation. She brought up Katherine's new film, asking about her character and what drew her to the role. For a moment, it seemed like the tension might ease. Katherine answered the question, but her tone was clipped, professional in a way that felt more like armor than engagement. She talked about the character's complexity, about the themes of the film, but she wasn't giving them the warmth and enthusiasm that morning shows thrive on. Jenna, perhaps feeling like she needed to regain control of the interview, made another attempt to circle back. She said that she thought audiences appreciated honesty, that Katherine's willingness to be open about her struggles in Hollywood was part of what made her relatable. She asked if Katherine felt like the industry had changed, if it was easier now for women to speak. Their minds, without being labeled Katherine, looked at her for a long moment before answering. She said that was a fascinating question, especially coming from someone who was essentially proving her point by using this interview to rehash old headlines instead of having a substantive conversation. She pointed out that they had spent more time talking about her supposed reputation than about her actual work, and she wondered if they would do the same to a male guest. The hosts went silent. Jenna's smile was frozen on her face, caught between trying to maintain the friendly morning show vibe and recognizing that this had become something else entirely. One of the co-hosts tried to protest, saying they had interviewed plenty of men and asked them tough questions too. Katherine raised an eyebrow and asked them to name one time they had spent the majority of an interview asking a male actor about being difficult to work with rather than about his craft. The co-host stammered, trying to think of an example. Katherine waited, her expression neutral but her silence damning. When no example came, Katherine nodded slowly, as if something had been confirmed. She said she appreciated the invitation to come on the show, but she was starting to feel like it had been extended under false pretenses. She'd been told this would be a conversation about her new film, about her production company, about the work she was passionate about. Instead, it felt like an ambush. Jenna's face flushed. She insisted it wasn't an ambush, that they were just trying to have an honest conversation. Katherine asked what was honest about ignoring the project she came to promote in favor of gossip. She wanted to know if they had actually watched her new film, if they had prepared any questions about it, or If the entire plan had been to focus on controversy because that got better ratings, the question hung in the air, unanswered. You could see the hosts exchanging glances, trying to figure out how to salvage this. Jenna finally said that of course they cared about Katherine's work, that they thought her film looked wonderful. Katherine asked her what it was about. Jenna hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. Katherine's expression hardened. She said she thought so. She said it was clear that no one had actually done their homework. That this interview had been booked not because they were interested in her current projects, but because her name came with built-in drama that they could exploit for their show. She said she had been doing this long enough to recognize when she was being used for content rather than being respected as an artist. Another host jumped in, her voice rising slightly in defense. She said that wasn't fair, that they had Katherine on because they admired her work and wanted to give her a platform. Katherine laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. She said that if they admired her work, they would be asking about it. She pointed out that they were now almost 15 minutes into the interview and had spent maybe 2 minutes on her actual film. The rest had been about old controversies and vague questions about her reputation. Jenna tried to take control back, saying they could talk about the film now, that they had plenty of time. But Katherine was shaking her head. She said that the damage was done, that the tone had been set, and she wasn't interested in participating in whatever this had become. She said she had been in this industry long enough to know when an interview was conducted in good faith, and when it was designed to create a viral moment at her expense. The studio was absolutely silent now. The crew behind the cameras had stopped moving. Everyone could feel that something was about to happen, that this had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jenna made one more attempt, her voice softer now, almost pleading. She said they didn't mean to upset Katherine, that if they had misstepped, they apologized. She asked if they could start over, refocus on the film. Katherine stood up.